No war, no anger, only remorse. They allowed humans to leave quietly. The council chamber fell silent when Ambassador Kyle Morrison placed the small wooden box on the crystalline table. Inside lay Earth's final gift to the Galactic Assembly, a gift nobody expected and fewer understood. The holographic display showed humanity's last coordinates, vessels already powering up across 17 colony worlds, preparing for departure into the void beyond charted space. Commander Victoria Shaw stood at the observation deck of the colony ship Horizon's Edge, watching the alien diplomats argue through the viewport. They had 3 days. 3 days before humanity would vanish from galactic civilization forever, and the aliens still believed this was a negotiation. It was not. The Zenithar delegate, his blue crystalline form refracting the chamber lights, demanded explanations. Why would humans abandon 200 years of careful integration? Why forsake the protection of the Assembly's military might? Why turn away from the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known? Kyle's answer was simple and devastating. Humanity was tired of being tolerated. For 2 centuries, humans had contributed everything asked of them. They had shared their music, their literature, their scientific innovations. Human engineers had redesigned the Assembly's faster-than-light drives, making them 40% more efficient. Human doctors had cured the Velotrix plague that killed millions. Human artists had brought tears to species that thought themselves beyond such emotions, and in return, humanity received politeness. Cold, measured, calculated politeness. The Kryn representative, a towering insectoid named Velkath, spoke of humanity's valued position in the Assembly. Kyle wanted to laugh. Valued position meant being excluded from the Council of Founders. It meant having their colony requests denied while less advanced species received prime worlds. It meant watching as every human achievement was praised with the same tone one might use to compliment a clever child. Nobody hated humanity. That would have been easier to bear. Hatred implied passion, implied that humans mattered enough to inspire strong emotion. Instead, the galaxy offered them the worst possible fate. Benign indifference dressed up as acceptance. Victoria remembered the day she understood. She had been leading a rescue mission, saving a Telkari science vessel from a collapsing star. The Telkari captain thanked her afterward, called her brave and resourceful, then asked if all humans were surprisingly capable for such a primitive species. Surprisingly capable. As if humanity's competence was an amusing quirk rather than the result of determination and skill. The vote to allow humanity's departure was unanimous. Of course it was. The aliens believed they were being gracious, letting the emotional humans have their tantrum. They expected humanity to return within a generation, humbled and ready to accept their place. Kyle closed the wooden box. Inside was a handwritten note that simply read, "Do not follow us." It was not a threat. It was not a plea. It was a boundary. Perhaps the first boundary humanity had ever truly enforced with the galactic community. The aliens would let humanity leave quietly because they did not understand what they were losing. They would not understand until it was far too late. 5 years after humanity's departure, the cracks began to show. It started with small things that seemed insignificant at first. The Velotrix medical stations reported a 3% decline in treatment efficacy. The newer doctors, trained without human methodology, could diagnose diseases but lacked the intuitive leaps that human physicians had demonstrated. They followed protocols perfectly but could not see the connections between seemingly unrelated symptoms. Engineer Marcus Chen had been the last human to leave the Cairo station, one of the Assembly's largest construction facilities. Before departing, he had handed over detailed manuals, specifications, and maintenance schedules. The Zenithar engineers thanked him politely and assured him they would manage fine. They had built stations for 3,000 years before humans arrived, after all. The Cairo station suffered its first major system failure 8 months after Marcus left. The Zenithar engineers followed the manuals precisely, replaced every component as specified, and the station functioned again. For 2 weeks. The second failure was worse. The third failure nearly killed everyone aboard. The problem was not the manuals. The problem was that Marcus had never written down the art of knowing when to deviate from procedure. He had never explained how to feel the subtle vibrations that warned of cascade failures 3 days before instruments detected them. He had tried to teach these things during his 20 years on the station, but his alien colleagues had smiled and nodded and continued following their protocols. The Kryn hive mind began experiencing what they clinically termed efficiency degradation. Their vast agricultural networks, feeding billions across 40 worlds, started producing 20% less yield. The soil composition was identical. The weather control systems functioned perfectly. Every variable matched optimal parameters. What the Kryn had forgotten was that human agronomist Linda Foster had spent 15 years walking their fields, talking to farmers, adjusting systems not by the numbers but by observation and instinct. She had taught them to read the land. But the Kryn had filed her advice under quaint human superstition. They preferred data. Now their data showed them failing, and they had no idea why. The Telkari Science Academy published a paper analyzing the phenomenon. They called it the human paradox. Humans had contributed to thousands of projects across the assembly, and now, without them, those projects were slowly deteriorating. The paper's conclusion was that humanity had created dependencies, forcing the galaxy to rely on their presence. It was an impressive display of missing the point entirely. Ambassador Velkath, now serving as the Assembly's liaison for cultural studies, began reviewing archive footage of human interactions. He watched Kyle Morrison's final speech 100 times, analyzing every word for hidden meanings or threats. There were none. Kyle had simply explained that humanity was leaving because they did not belong. Velkath started noticing patterns he had missed before. In meetings, humans had asked questions that seemed obvious or even stupid at the time. Why do you do it that way? Have you considered this alternative? What if we combine these two approaches? The alien representatives had answered with patience and barely concealed condescension, explaining the established methods that had worked for millennia. But humans had not been challenging the methods. They had been offering improvements, innovations, new perspectives. And the galaxy had smiled and nodded and continued doing things the way they had always been done. The entertainment industry collapsed first. Galactic media had become stale over centuries, repeating the same themes and stories because they resonated with the established cultural framework. Human artists had injected chaos into that framework. They told stories that broke rules, created music that defied categorization, painted images that made no logical sense yet somehow moved the soul. Without humans, the galaxy returned to its comfortable patterns. Within 2 years, viewership dropped 60%. The Zenithar tried commissioning new works from their best artists. The results were technically perfect and emotionally sterile. Nobody could articulate what was missing, but everyone felt the absence. Counselor Thera of the Luminex Collective stood before the assembly and proposed sending a diplomatic mission to find humanity and request their return. The proposal died before reaching a vote. It would be beneath the assembly's dignity to admit they needed anyone. Besides, surely humanity would return on their own once they realized how difficult survival was without assembly support. But the listening posts along the human exodus route reported something troubling. The human ships were not struggling. They were thriving. Energy signatures showed expanding infrastructure. Communication intercepts, carefully analyzed by assembly intelligence, revealed colonies, establishing new trade networks, scientific breakthroughs, artistic movements. The humans were not suffering from their isolation. They were flourishing. Admiral Peter Grant, commander of the civilian vessel New Dawn, sent one transmission back toward assembly space. It was not a distress call or a request to return. It was a simple message recorded at the request of his crew. We do not hate you. We do not blame you. We understand that you could not see us as equals, because in your framework we would always be the newcomers, the students, the younger siblings who showed promise but would never quite measure up. And you gave us knowledge and protection, and for that we are grateful. But we needed something you could not provide, recognition that we had already grown up. We are building something new out here, something ours. We hope you find what you are looking for. Do not follow us. The message played once in the assembly chamber. Nobody responded. What could they say? The humans were right, and that truth hurt more than any accusation ever could. 10 years after the Exodus, the Draxian Syndicate made its move. The Draxians had always been aggressive, pushing boundaries, testing limits. For centuries, the Assembly had maintained peace through overwhelming force and diplomatic pressure, but the Draxians were patient predators, and they had noticed something interesting. The Assembly's response times had increased. Their tactical innovations had stalled. Their military commanders followed doctrine but lacked adaptability. The Draxians struck 3 border stations simultaneously, overwhelming defenses that should have held for weeks. They expected counterattacks, expected the Assembly's legendary tactical genius to crush their advance. Instead, they found confusion and rigid adherence to outdated battle plans. Colonel Natalie Brooks had been the Assembly's leading military strategist before humanity left. She had revolutionized their approach to asymmetric warfare, taught them to think like their enemies, to anticipate rather than react. The Assembly commanders had nodded politely during her lectures, then returned to their time-tested formations and predictable responses. Now those same commanders stared at tactical displays showing Draxian forces cutting through their lines like tissue paper. The enemy was not stronger or better equipped. They were simply more creative, more willing to take risks, more adapted to chaos. Everything the Assembly military had forgotten how to handle. The war lasted 6 months before the Assembly sued for peace, ceding 2 entire sectors to Draxian control. It was the first major defeat in Assembly history, and the implications rippled through galactic civilization like a shockwave. If the mighty Assembly could fall, what did that mean for everyone else? Councilor Thera called an emergency session. The chamber was packed with representatives from every member species, all demanding answers, all terrified that their worlds might be next. Velkath presented his findings, years of research compiled into one devastating conclusion. Humanity had not created dependencies. Humanity had been the Assembly's immune system, constantly challenging their assumptions, forcing adaptation, preventing stagnation. Without that constant pressure to evolve, the Assembly had begun to calcify. They were still technologically advanced, still powerful, but they had lost something vital. They had lost the ability to grow. The Zenithar delegate refused to accept this. Surely one species could not have made such a difference. Surely the mighty civilizations that had ruled the galaxy for millennia were not reliant on a race that had barely left their home system 2 centuries ago. But the evidence was undeniable. Every sector where humans had worked closely with local populations showed slower decline than areas where human involvement had been minimal. Every project that had incorporated human suggestions was still functioning well. Every cultural exchange program with heavy human participation had produced lasting benefits. The humans had been everywhere, touching everything, leaving fingerprints on 1,000 different initiatives, and everyone had smiled and thanked them and filed their contributions under helpful but ultimately unnecessary. A junior analyst named Crix, barely out of academic training, asked the question that nobody wanted to hear. What if we are wrong about everything? What if the problem is not that humans are gone, but that we never truly listened when they were here? The chamber fell silent. Crix continued, voice trembling but determined. What if humans were not the students we thought they were? What if we were the ones being taught, and we were too arrogant to realize it? Velkath wanted to dismiss the young analyst, but he could not. Every data point supported that conclusion. Humans had not just contributed to Assembly civilization, they had been actively trying to save it from its own stagnation, and the Assembly had treated their efforts like a child's finger painting, appreciated for the sentiment rather than the content. The Luminex delegation proposed a solution. Send an expedition into deep space to find humanity. Offer them whatever they wanted to return. Full council membership, prime colony worlds, equal status with the founding species, whatever it took. The proposal was voted down within minutes. The Assembly's pride would not allow such open desperation. Instead, they authorized a covert intelligence mission. Find the humans, observe them, gather information on their current status and location. Then the Assembly could decide on an appropriate course of action. It took 3 years to locate the human colonies. They were far beyond the galactic rim, in a region the Assembly had deemed uninhabitable due to unstable star formations and dangerous radiation fields. Apparently, humans had looked at the word uninhabitable and decided it was negotiable. The intelligence vessel Silent Observer maintained position at the edge of sensor range, watching the human colonies with a mix of fascination and growing horror. Horror, because the humans were not just surviving, they were building something magnificent. The colonies were linked by a network of stations that should not have been possible to construct in such hostile space. Human ships moved through radiation fields that would kill most species in minutes, protected by shielding technology that the Assembly did not recognize. The humans had not just adapted to the dangerous environment. They had thrived in it precisely because it was dangerous. Captain Zoran, commanding the Silent Observer, filed daily reports. Each one painted a picture of human society that contradicted everything the Assembly thought they knew. The humans had not retreated into isolated survival. They had formed a loose confederation of independent colonies, each one different, each one experimental, each one innovating at a pace that made Assembly scientists nervous. They had encountered 3 other species in deep space, refugees and outcasts who had been fleeing various conflicts. The humans had not conquered them or absorbed them. They had welcomed them, learned from them, integrated them into their growing civilization as equals. True equals, not the polite fiction the Assembly had offered humanity. More disturbing were the reports of human military exercises. The Assembly had always assumed human military doctrine was based on what they had learned from Assembly training, but the exercises showed something entirely different. The humans fought like no species the Assembly had ever encountered, combining aggression with creativity, discipline with flexibility, cooperation with individual initiative. Zoran realized with cold certainty that if humanity ever decided to return to assembly space, it would not be as supplicants requesting readmission. It would be as something else entirely, something the galaxy was not prepared to face. The decision to make contact came from someone unexpected. Captain Zoran had been filing reports for 8 months, watching the human colonies grow and evolve, when a young human pilot in a small exploration craft detected the silent observer. The human did not attack or flee. Instead, he opened a communication channel and asked a simple question in perfect assembly standard. "Are you here to observe or participate?" Zoran scrambled to respond, caught completely off guard. The human pilot introduced himself as Danny Carson, and he explained that human long-range sensors had detected the assembly vessel 3 months ago. They had been waiting to see what the observers would do. Now Danny was offering an invitation. "Come see what we have built. No tricks, no demands, just an open door." Zoran knew he should refuse and report back to the assembly. His mission was intelligence gathering, not first contact. But 8 months of watching humans create something beautiful in the darkness had changed him. He accepted the invitation. The human colony of New Terra welcomed the silent observer with neither hostility nor excessive enthusiasm. They treated the assembly crew like curious neighbors who had finally decided to visit, which was somehow more unsettling than any hostile reception. Commander Sarah Wu, the colony's elected leader, gave Zoran a tour that systematically destroyed every assumption he had about human capabilities. The colony's power generation came from harvesting energy directly from solar storms, a technique assembly scientists had deemed impossible due to the unpredictable nature of the radiation. Human engineers had looked at unpredictable and built adaptive systems that learned and evolved with each storm cycle. Their efficiency exceeded assembly reactors by a factor of 3. The agricultural domes grew food using methods that combined assembly hydroponic technology with techniques borrowed from the Vekari refugees and innovations that were purely human creativity. The result was crop yields that should not have been mathematically possible in such limited space. But what truly disturbed Zoran was the diversity. New Terra was not a human colony with alien residents. It was a genuinely multicultural settlement where humans, Vekari, Sylthian, and even a few Draxian defectors worked together as equals. He watched a human teacher instructing Vekari children in mathematics, while a Sylthian engineer explained their crystal-based computing to a group of human students. There was no hierarchy, no obvious power structure, just people learning from each other. Sarah Wu explained their philosophy over dinner, a meal that blended human, Vekari, and Sylthian cuisine into something that should not have worked but somehow did. The assembly operated on the principle of order and established wisdom. Humanity had chosen a different path. They operated on the principle of creative chaos, constantly mixing ideas, constantly challenging assumptions, constantly evolving. "You asked us to fit into your system," Sarah said quietly. "But your system was not designed for growth. It was designed for stability, and stability is just another word for stagnation." Zoran wanted to argue, but he had seen the evidence with his own eyes. The assembly had achieved peace and prosperity by establishing rules and structures that worked. The problem was that once something worked, they never changed it. They had optimized for consistency, not adaptation. Humans had optimized for something else entirely. They had optimized for potential. Sarah offered Zoran access to their historical records, their scientific databases, everything they had learned and built in 15 years of isolation. She asked for nothing in return. The generosity made Zoran deeply uncomfortable. In assembly culture, gifts came with obligations. In human culture, apparently, knowledge was simply shared because sharing made everyone stronger. He spent 2 weeks on New Terra, talking to colonists, observing their society, trying to understand how they had accomplished so much in so little time. The answer was both simple and profound. They had removed the weight of expected behavior. Nobody told humans they could not attempt the impossible, so they attempted it. Nobody told Vekari refugees they were inferior, so they contributed their best ideas. Nobody told Sylthian engineers their methods were outdated, so they refined those methods into something new. When Zoran prepared to leave, Sarah gave him a message to take back to the assembly. It was not a demand or a threat. It was an invitation. We left because you could not see us. We understand that now. You saw the universe through the lens of your own success, and anything that did not fit that lens was diminished. We do not blame you for this, but we also cannot return to it. If the assembly wishes to learn from us, you are welcome to send people here. We will teach them everything we know. But we will not return to being your students when you were never truly our teachers. We were always meant to be colleagues, and out here we have finally found civilizations that understand that. The message was respectful, kind even. It was also a complete rejection of everything the assembly represented. Zoran returned to assembly space and delivered his report. The council chambers erupted in arguments that lasted for weeks. Some representatives insisted on military action to force human compliance. Others suggested trade sanctions or diplomatic pressure. A few brave voices suggested that perhaps the humans were right and the assembly needed to change. The debate raged until news arrived that changed everything. The Draxian Syndicate was mobilizing for another offensive, this time targeting the core assembly worlds. Intelligence suggested they had been studying human tactical innovations, adapting human unpredictability to their own aggressive strategies. The assembly faced a threat unlike anything in their history, and they had no idea how to counter it. Councillor Thera stood before the assembly and said what everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to admit. The assembly needed help. They needed the one thing they had spent 2 centuries refusing to acknowledge. They needed humanity, not as subordinates or students, but as equals. And they had no idea if humans would even answer the call. The vote was close, embarrassingly close for such an existential decision. In the end, pride gave way to survival by a margin of 3 votes. The assembly would send an official diplomatic mission to human space, requesting military assistance against the Draxian threat. Ambassador Velkath volunteered to lead the mission, perhaps because he understood better than most what they had lost. The diplomatic ship Concordance made the journey to New Terra in 14 days, pushing their engines beyond recommended limits because the Draxian fleet would reach assembly core worlds in less than a month. Velkath had prepared speeches, arguments, appeals to old alliances and shared history. He arrived expecting negotiations, prepared to offer concessions. Instead, Commander Sarah Wu listened to his request, nodded once, and said they would help. Just like that. No demands, no conditions, no political maneuvering. The simplicity of it left Velkath speechless. Sarah explained that humanity had been monitoring the Draxian buildup for months. They had known an attack was coming and had already been debating whether to intervene. Velkath's request simply made the decision easier. When he asked why humans would help people who had dismissed and undervalued them for 200 years, Sarah's answer was both humbling and devastating. Because you need help and we can provide it. That is reason enough. The human response fleet assembled in 3 days. 20 ships, a fraction of the assembly's navy, but built using technology that made assembly vessels look primitive. Captain Danny Carson commanded the flagship Aurora, and his crew was a mix of humans and the various species who had joined their colonies. They jumped to assembly space with calm efficiency, arriving 2 weeks before the Draxian offensive. The Assembly Military Command struggled to integrate human forces into their battle plans. The humans operated on principles that violated every doctrine the Assembly held sacred. Their formations were loose and adaptive. Their command structure emphasized individual initiative over centralized control. Their tactics incorporated elements of chaos theory that made Assembly strategists nervous. Admiral Hayes of the Zenithar fleet tried to impose Assembly tactical doctrine on the human ships. Danny Carson politely declined. The humans would coordinate with Assembly forces, share intelligence, support the overall defense strategy, but they would fight their own way. Hayes could accept that or waste precious time arguing. He accepted. The Draxian fleet arrived with overwhelming force, 300 vessels against the Assembly's combined fleet of 800. The numbers should have favored the defenders, but everyone remembered how easily the Draxians had torn through those same defenses before. This time would be different, but not for the reasons the Assembly expected. The battle began with standard Draxian tactics, probing attacks designed to identify weaknesses in the defensive formation. Assembly fleet responded with their updated doctrine, trying to incorporate lessons learned from their previous defeat. They were competent, professional, and predictable. The human ships did something else entirely. They ignored the formation, broke away in groups of 3 and 4, and engaged Draxian forces in ways that made no tactical sense. They baited enemies into pursuit, then collapsed on them from unexpected angles. They feinted weakness, then struck with devastating precision. They made the battle chaotic, unpredictable, and the Draxians suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy they could not anticipate. More importantly, the human ships created opportunities for the Assembly fleet. When Draxian formations broke to pursue human vessels, they exposed flanks to Assembly firepower. When human ships drew enemy attention, Assembly ships maneuvered into superior positions. The humans were not trying to win the battle alone. They were teaching the Assembly fleet how to fight creatively in real time. Admiral Hayes watched from his command center as human tactics transformed the battlefield. He began issuing orders that deviated from doctrine, taking risks, adapting to chaos. His officers hesitated, then followed his lead. Across the fleet, Assembly commanders started improvising, started trusting their instincts, started thinking like the humans had tried to teach them decades ago. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the Draxian fleet was in full retreat, having lost over a third of their vessels. The Assembly had lost fewer than 50 ships, and the human fleet reported only 3 vessels damaged, none destroyed. The victory was so complete that it seemed impossible, but Velkath understood. The humans had not just defended Assembly space. They had demonstrated everything the Assembly had failed to learn. Adaptation, creativity, the willingness to take calculated risks, the ability to work with different approaches rather than demanding conformity. In 6 hours, humanity had taught the Assembly more than 2 centuries of peaceful coexistence had managed. Commander Sarah Wu arrived at the Assembly Council chambers 3 days after the battle. She came alone, without guards or advisors, and she spoke words that would be recorded in every historical archive across the galaxy. You allowed us to leave quietly, and we are grateful for that mercy. You did not understand what you were losing, but you respected our choice. Now we offer you a choice in return. Continue as you are, powerful but stagnant, safe but unchanging, or embrace the chaos of growth. Learn to value difference instead of demanding similarity. Accept that being wrong sometimes is the price of learning. Understand that the strongest civilizations are not those that never fall, but those that stand up each time they do. She paused, looking at the assembled representatives of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. We will not rejoin the Assembly. Our path leads elsewhere, to places you have deemed too dangerous, to ideas you have deemed too radical. But our door remains open. Send us your students, your innovators, your misfits and dreamers. Send us those who question and those who dare. We will teach them what we know, and they will return to teach you. This is our gift, freely given, because we remember what it was like to need recognition and receive only polite tolerance. The Assembly never found the words to properly thank humanity. How do you thank someone for showing you that your greatest weakness was mistaken comfort for wisdom? How do you apologize for 2 centuries of benign indifference to people who refuse to hold grudges? In the end, the Assembly did the only thing they could. They accepted the gift with the grace they should have shown from the beginning. They sent their brightest minds to human space, not to teach, but to learn. They began the slow, difficult process of changing themselves. And humanity, having finally been seen for what they truly were, continued their journey into the darkness between stars, building something new, something wild, something that would make the galaxy better simply by existing outside its boundaries. The Assembly learned their lesson. Some truths only become clear in absence. Some gifts only gain value when lost. And sometimes the greatest act of wisdom is admitting you were wrong and changing course before it is too late. They had allowed humans to leave quietly. The humans had responded by saving them anyway. It was the most human thing they could have done, and the galaxy would spend centuries trying to understand the generosity behind that choice.